Greetings and salutations, everyone. This is your teacher here, Jeremy Chiquette, on this wonderful evening of February 8th, 2022, which is probably not when you're going to be watching this lecture. My guess is it'll probably be February 9th, February 10th, something like that, whatever. But welcome either way. Now, we will be discussing the quantity theory of money on NyQuil, and we will be doing this on a little race before my NyQuil kicks in. Yeah, I know. It's going to be great, isn't it? Woohoo! Let's all have fun, guys. So, without any further ado, I'm sure I probably say that a lot. I probably need to find something else to say, but that's just me. Let's get moving. So, we're going to talk about the quantity theory of money. It's also what's known as the equation of exchange, and we'll see why in a little bit. So the quantity theory of money is essentially a way of relating the money supply, what's known as the velocity of money, to nominal GDP. So equation 1 says M times V equals P times Y. What is all this crap? Well, M is the money supply, so it's a monetary aggregate of sorts. V is the velocity of money, which is a measurement of how fast money changes hands. We'll get to this in a little bit, don't worry. It seems kind of obscure, and you're like, okay, well, how the hell do you measure that? Well, we've got ways of measuring it, don't worry. P is the price level, and, well, the last thing is real output or real GDP, which hence, it's a lowercase variable indicating it's a real economic variable. So price times output is equal to nominal GDP. So the money supply times how fast money changes hands is equal to nominal GDP. So let's stop and think about that for a second, right? If there's $100 in the economy, right, and money changes hands fairly slowly, right? Let's say money only changes hands twice. Twice per what? Let's say twice per day, okay? Or twice per quarter. Okay, so money changes hands twice per quarter. Well, there's $100 in the economy, right, in nominal money terms, right? $100 in the nominal money supply times the number of times it changes hands, let's say 2, right? What is nominal GDP going to be equal to? 200, right? But if we have, say, 100 times that money is changing hands, well, 100 times 100 is now 10,000. Nominal GDP is equal to $10,000. So that's kind of a way to, intuitively, and by intuitively, I really just mean mathematically, but, those two are the exact same for me because I'm weird. It's a good way to sort of think about how we can get some sort of intuitive understanding of what the quantity theory of money is actually telling us. Now, the velocity of money, the number of times it changes hands, it's also what's known as the Cambridge K. And the Cambridge K is expressed as this, where it is the inverse of the velocity of money. So the velocity of money would be equal to 1 over K, or K to the negative 1. So the Cambridge K is the inverse of the velocity of money. Now, we can rewrite the quantity theory of money equation incorporating the Cambridge K rather than the velocity of money as this right here. Why do we have it like this? Well, think about it, right? It would be M times 1 over K equals PT times YT. Well, if we multiply both sides by K, we get M equals K times P times Y. So the Cambridge K reflects the ratio of total transactions to income, right? Or you can think of it as the ratio of desired money balances to money transactions. So let's talk about a special case of the velocity of money, or really the inverse of K. We discussed the income elasticity of demand a couple of weeks ago. If that is equal to 1, and the interest rates have no effect on the demand for money, then K and V are constants, right? So they're not changing over time. The income elasticity of demand, remember, is how demand changes with respect to changes in income, right? So when we think about it in the context of money, the income elasticity of money demand is how the demand for money will change with respect to a change in income. It basically tells us how sensitive the household will be to changes in their demand for money if their income changes by 1%, whether it goes up or it goes down. If the elasticity is equal to 1, then it means the quantity of money demanded will also change by 1%. Thus, when we have this elasticity equal to 1, K and V are constant or time invariant. If we want to look at the price level and money relative to real income in the United States, well, feel free to take a look. Okay, moving on. So we can see that the price level and the money supply are closely related, right? Because, well, we look at this over time. We look at the price level and we look at the increase in the money supply. As the money supply increases, what seems to increase not long after that? Well, the price level. So they're going to be fairly highly correlated with one another. If you change the money supply, the price level is going to change as well. So we can see that it does, to some extent, hopefully, make some intuitive sense with what we were talking about earlier when it came to monetary neutrality, right? Changes in the money supply only affecting nominal variables and not real variables. All right, if we go back, we can take a look at this. Well, the price level is a nominal variable, and money is a nominal variable. So if there's a change to the money supply, what we can see is that eventually the price level begins to increase as well. And as the price level begins to increase, right, it's a nominal variable picking up the slack of a real variable. So the more this nominal variable moves, right, the less a real economic variable like unemployment or GDP will be responding because the price level will respond instead. Right? But, wait a minute. I thought monetary neutrality was long-run stuff. And, well, it is sometimes. But what we can see is that if we increase the money supply, prices will increase as well. And, that's fairly easy to think about here because if we increase the amount of money going around, but we're not changing the amount of stuff that we're making, what happens is the price of that stuff that's being made goes up, right? If you doubled the money supply, but output or production didn't change at all, right, what you would see is an increase in prices, probably pretty close to a doubling of prices, right? So printing money doesn't mean that we're going to get more stuff. Let's take a look at this here, right? So we've got the money supply, or M2, and this is expressed in billions of US dollars between 1959 and 2022. So this is the M2 money supply. Let's take a look at the money velocity, right? So this is expressed as that ratio that I was talking about. We can see that, it goes up sometimes, goes down sometimes. Well, that's kind of what you would expect. Here's the interesting thing, though, right? The money velocity. Look at what the money velocity did right around 2020. What happened? Well, boom, it fell. Pretty dramatically, too, I might add. Why did it do that? Well, what happened in 2020? Didn't something really important happen then? Oh, yeah. Yeah, it was that coronavirus thing. Yeah. So, well, what happened? Well, we basically had those giant shutdowns. People were forced to stay home. Depending on what state you were in, you were forced to stay home for longer than some other states. But the economy basically ground to a halt. And when it did that, what did the money velocity do? Well, it fell dramatically because money wasn't changing hands because the economy was, well, not doing a whole lot. So we can kind of see, like, what we can sort of expect from the money velocity when it comes to the state of the economy, right? Let's look at another instance here, right? The financial crisis of 2007, 2008. Well, we can see around 2007, 2008, the money velocity begins to drop pretty dramatically, right? Not as dramatically as it did in 2020, but it still dropped quite a bit. Now, eventually it kind of picked back up, and you can see it sort of fell again all through the 2010s, but there's a pretty dramatic reduction in the money velocity between 2007-ish and about 2009. So we can see here, right, there's like some cyclicality to this, or really, I guess, counter-cyclical. Or would it be pro-cyclical? It would be pro-cyclical, yeah, because as economic output begins to fall, we can see there are at least some cases where the money velocity is going to fall as well, right? So if we go into a recession, production falls, economic activity starts to slow down a little bit. Well, people aren't going to be spending as much money, right? Consumption is not going to be as high as it would be otherwise. So the money velocity is going to fall. So it would be pro-cyclical with GDP or unemployment. Let's look at the core PCE price index. All right. This is the price index that the Federal Reserve looks at when they're trying to monitor inflation. Now, when they're monitoring inflation, they're not monitoring the level of the core PCE price index. They're looking at the annualized rate of change, right? Or the year over year, you could say growth rate in the price index. This is just the price level, though, right? This is, set to an index. And so, yeah, we can see that, it's been, for the most part, steadily increasing from about, a little after 1990 up until about 2021-ish, late 2020, early 2021. It was growing at a fairly steady rate. And then, well, there's that little uptick there right at the end. Let's point it out right here. If we look at this guy right here, right, this is where inflation begins to spike up a good bit, which, is pretty consistent with what we have been seeing the last year or so in the economy, where the inflation rate has picked up. Now, here's the interesting thing, right? A lot of people say, oh, this is the worst inflation we've had. Well, it's the worst inflation that you have had in your lifetimes. It's about the worst inflation I have had in my lifetime. I'm quite a bit older than you guys, but I am not so old as to have experienced the 1970s. Now here, this is pretty bad because we had pretty high inflation, and it got really, really bad here around 1980, and then you can see it levels off. Well, what happened? This is when Paul Volcker, who was chairman of the Federal Reserve at the time, essentially just cut the money supply, raised interest rates dramatically, threw the economy into a recession for a little bit. However, it eventually leveled off the rate of inflation, slowed the rate of inflation quite a bit, and we had what's known as the Great Moderation, which, as you can see, if you were to sort of draw a straight line from about here to here, it's going to be pretty much parallel with what the trend line here would look like, right? So it's just a nice little tidbit of information there. But yeah, the 1970s were an absolutely terrible decade when it comes to inflation. Okay, so let's look at real GDP. All right, so this is real GDP, again, billions of dollars. And we can see that there are, upswings, there are downswings. This is the financial crisis of 2007, 2008. And that was pretty bad, right? This was the worst economic decline that we had had since the Great Depression. And then 2020 is like, hey, hold my beer. It's pretty bad what happened in 2020. It's like really, really bad when you look at it. Now, it was a very quick recovery versus the type of recovery that we had here, where it just sort of dropped and then continued along a new trend line. Here, at least, it sort of returns the trend, as we can see. But yeah, so here's real GDP over time. So let's take a look at how this works mathematically. All right, remember, the quantity theory of money was equal to M times V equals P times Y. And let's say I want to get the percent change of this guy over time, because we can play around with it in levels, or we can also play around with it in terms of a percentage change or log differences. So I'm going to do that, right? I'm going to get log differences or percent changes of equation 4, and it's going to give me this here. The percent change in the money supply equals the percent plus the percent change in the velocity is equal to the percent change in prices plus the percent change in real GDP. Now, what's the percent change of the price level? Well, that's the inflation rate. So what we get is essentially the growth rate in the money supply plus the growth rate in the velocity is equal to inflation plus the growth rate in real GDP. So, all right, how do we get this? Well, if we want percent changes, we got to do the whole new minus old over old thing, which for the quantity theory of money, we would get this. Oh, excuse me. So we get this guy right here. This is for the quantity theory of money. We just basically convert everything into percent changes. Now, when I do that, All right, what I've got here is the year-over-year growth rate in the money supply. I'm using the year-over-year because when we start to think about inflation, it's going to be year-over-year, not quarter-over-quarter or month-over-month, because, well, that's the way the Federal Reserve looks at it, right? They look at the year-over-year growth rate in the price level, so I decided why not look at the year-over-year growth rate and everything. So we've got the year-over-year growth rate in M2, which you can see there's some upswings, there's some downswings. Here's the interesting thing, though. Look at what M2 did during the coronavirus outbreak. It spiked pretty dramatically. All right, why is that? Well, the very, very, very loose monetary policy measures enacted by the Federal Reserve in response to the coronavirus outbreak, which is very likely one of the reasons why we're experiencing rather high inflation rate right now and why the Federal Reserve is going to be tightening their monetary policy in the very, very near future. Let's look at the money velocity. Wow. Okay, so, wow, look at the way the growth rate and the money velocity dropped during the coronavirus pandemic. That was pretty bad. That's like awful. All right, let's look at the core PCE price index growth rate, or the rate of inflation. Wow, would you look at that? Look at that inflation rate right around 2021 or so, leading into 2022. It's a pretty high inflation rate. Now, it's not as high as what we had in, like, say, the 1970s. It's not as high as what we had right after 1980, but it's about the highest we've had since then. It's pretty bad. And then we've got the growth rate in real GDP, which we can see. Again, look at 2020. You can see what that did. That was pretty bad. And yeah, so this is what these variables would look like using real data in terms of their growth rates. We want to put them all together. This is what we get, right? We just sort of plot them all over each other. You can kind of see what's going on with some of this stuff. So take a look at this and try to see what you think would be positively correlated, what would be negatively correlated, right? What stuff is going up? What stuff's going down? What's kind of moving in one direction, like sort of all together? What's moving in opposite directions? Take a look at that. And then also when you're looking at this, try to come up with like a narrative, right, for why you think some of these things would be increasing versus why they would be decreasing, right? And why they would be moving together or in opposite directions. So just nice little homework assignment for you guys. So let's take care of a couple of things when it comes to what we're going to do next. First, if something doesn't change over time, like let's say the velocity of money, last quarter was, 1.12, and this quarter it's also 1.12, then what we get is that new minus old over old, 1.12 minus 1.12 over 1.12 equals 0. Right? So if it's constant over time or it's time invariant, its percent change over time is going to be equal to 0. So V is a constant. The percent change of a constant is 0, which gives me this. The growth rate in the money supply equals inflation plus the growth rate in real GDP. Now I can simplify a few more things, and I can express the percent change in the price level as inflation. So the growth rate in the money supply equals inflation plus the growth rate in real gross domestic product. Now, if I want to solve this for pi, what I get, if I want to solve it for inflation, is I get the percent change in money minus the percent change in real GDP is equal to the inflation rate. So that equation right there says that should the income elasticity of demand for money be equal to 1, then the rate of change in the price level is equal to the rate of change in the money supply minus the rate of change in income, right? So inflation is equal to the rate of change in the money supply minus the rate of change in your income or your GDP. I have no idea why this is trying to start make noise right now because it literally just started playing itself. No idea why it started playing a Joe Rogan video, because I wasn't even listening to Joe Rogan earlier. I was listening to Tim Pool, but I wasn't listening to Joe Rogan, so I have no idea why that started playing. Anyways, moving right along from that. based on this relationship, we have a way to tie money growth in with inflation. Now, I talked about a helicopter drop, essentially, right, where I doubled the amount of money circulating in the economy. It's what's known as a helicopter drop. That existed, right? That happened, but no one makes more stuff. Well, in that case, right, if you doubled the money supply, but there was no change in output whatsoever, then the percent change in output is equal to 0. And when the percent change in output is equal to 0, well, there's no change in output. Thus, the velocity of money is constant. The growth rate in real GDP is constant. So then what we get is an interesting situation where the price level is directly proportional to the initial quantity of money. So percent change in V and percent change in Y are equal to 0, which tells me that the inflation rate is equal to the percent change in the money supply. This says that if there would be no change in output whatsoever, any percentage change that there is in the money supply leads to a similar magnitude increase in the rate of inflation. So if you increase the money supply by 20%, well, we're all screwed because there's going to be a 20% rate of inflation. And it provides some theoretical support, really, behind that graph that we saw of money and prices, right? Where there was like the pretty proportional increases in the money supply with the proportional increase in price. Now, there are times where changes in the money supply or changes in money growth can be changing output. And we will definitely be talking about this much more a little bit later on in the course. But it's actually fairly common, really, when there are changes in the money supply that lead to some change in output. So I don't want you to think that, this is always, that equation 13 is just the way it always is, because it's not. Sometimes, yes. Always, definitely not. If there's growth in output going on while the money supply increases, right, then it's going to essentially slow the inflation rate down. So let's just say, for example, right, the percent change in money is equal to 5%. Percent change in output 0. We want to know what inflation is. Well, we just do the little plug and play. We get inflation is equal to 5%. But now let's let growth rate in the money supply be equal to 5%. Growth rate in output be equal to 3%. Well, what's inflation going to be equal to now? Well, at this point, we do the same thing. We plug everything into the quantity theory of money equation in terms of the percent changes, and we get something a little different, right? We get 5% minus 3% equals 2%. So if we get a change in output, it's going to reduce the rate of inflation. If money grows, it increases the rate of inflation, but if output grows as a result of this change in money growth, then the rate of inflation is going to decrease a little bit. So can we see if this bears out in the data? Well, go back and look at the plots that I posted up in this lecture, excuse me, and take a look. See what you find, right? See if you see any change in the money supply and then changes in output and inflation. And if you would like, actually, I'd be more than happy to post the Excel spreadsheet that I had that has all that data in it. Take a look at the data and see what you find. Right? You might get some pretty interesting stuff there. Now, not everybody liked this theory, right? Pissed a lot of people off. And it's a pretty common thing in econ, to be honest with you, where not everyone agrees on some kind of theoretical formula, background, theoretical, formulation, and whatever, right? Not everybody thinks that it's going to be awesome to use. There are all sorts of economists that have, these really crazy views that, a gold standard is a good idea or something like that. And there's all sorts of economists that, are reasonable that think that a gold standard is not a good idea. There are more of the reasonable kind than there are the unreasonable. So there's at least that little bit we can sleep easily at night. But there are economists that think that, predictable changes in monetary policy can lead to predictable changes in output. And there are other economists that think maybe that doesn't always hold. Maybe that's not always the case, right? There's all sorts of disagreement in economics, especially macroeconomics, when macro policy comes into play. And it's like, how much should the government spend? How much should the Federal Reserve, inject into the money base? Things like that. it can get pretty contentious. And strangely enough, for you guys, not for me, because I've already been through all this stuff, but these debates are generally pretty mathematical in nature, and they're not really always partisan. Like, you'll get fairly conservative Republicans siding with the Federal Reserve, just like you'll have fairly liberal Democrats siding with the Federal Reserve. Both will be in support of various changes to monetary policy. All right. Fed Chair Jerome Powell was recently reappointed to a second term as FOMC chair. And, well, his nomination had to clear the Senate. And, he cleared the Senate. He was appointed by a Republican 4 years ago, cleared the Republican Senate then, but now it's a Democrat-controlled Senate, and he went through anyways, right? It's not always a partisan thing. Now, there are predictable sides, right? There are, if you were to pick a side like, well, the government shouldn't be spending any more money on stimulus through the pandemic, right? Who do you think would be saying that? It's pretty obvious. But when it comes to these economic debates, they're generally pretty economic debates between economists. They're generally pretty mathematical, and they're not particularly partisan. Now, there are all sorts of different ways that we can test some of these theories, right? Which ones are good, which ones are bad. There's a lot that can just immediately be thrown in the trash, and there's some that do have some validity that, become very valid, useful arguments. Now, depending on the way that they're tested, they can get different results, which gives us different implications for the validity of that theory. So if you decide to test one functional form against another, well, there's going to have to be a pretty good reasoning, pretty good rationale behind why one of those functional forms would be more valid than the other. Hence, it becomes a mathematical debate. And that'll explain why you will have different economists coming to different types of conclusions. Now, one of the issues that people have had with the quantity theory of money is what's known as a causal path. Critics of this theory have argued that all the factors in the equation are interrelated. Right, so we can say that these guys are endogenous to one another. If you change one, you're going to be changing all the others as well. Right, a shock to the money supply will cause a different ordering of responses than, say, a change to the price level. These orderings usually go from the slowest to fastest moving variables. For example, velocity of money would go first, then the money supply, price level, and finally output. That ordering implies a causal ordering of shocks, right? Now, this is important when we talk about some stuff with various business cycle models a little bit later in the course. But this causal path is kind of like, okay, well, it's like a what came first, the chicken or the egg type question, right? That's what's known as the causal path. And like I said, we'll get a little bit more into this stuff and causal inference when we talk about business cycle models. But yeah, I'll leave it there for now. Now, a major critic, or a major set of critics really, would be anybody from the Keynesian school of economics that would argue a change in the money supply may not necessarily lead to an increase in the price level. Right? If the economy's in a recession, it's going to be having unemployed resources, right? Capital and labor that are used in production typically aren't being used right now. So at the aggregate, labor and capital aren't being fully utilized. And expansionary monetary policy could lead to a better outcome where we have more employment, right? These resources are being more fully utilized. So the idea would be, like, if we're in a slump, an increase in the money supply leads to a larger increase in output than prices or inflation would. All right, so output responds more than inflation does when the economy's in a slump because we've got resources that could be used that aren't being used. But when we're closer to our productive capacity, right, we're not in a recession and the economy is booming. The economy is doing really, really, really well. An increase in the money supply is going to lead to larger increases in prices or inflation than we would get in an increase in output, because output can't really increase much more than where it is because it's pretty much maxed out, right? This is kind of what it would look like. All right, so if we're looking at like a Phillips curve for output, there is a region here, everything to the left of this vertical purple line, everything to the left is where output would be much more responsive than inflation would be. Everything to the right of this vertical line is where the price level would be more responsive than output would be. So if we're in this region of output, right, we're in a recession, things aren't doing so well, an increase in the money supply will likely increase output quite a bit. But if you look, there's very little change to inflation here. Now, let's say we're here. The economy's booming. Things are doing really well. And the central bank decides they want to increase the money supply. Well, if they do that, you're going to get a little bit of an increase in output, but you're going to have a major jump in the price level, leading to high inflation. So there are times where expansionary monetary policy is a good idea, and there are times where more contractionary policies are a good idea. Everything over here, it's a very good idea to have expansionary monetary policy. Over here, that is a terrible idea. So there are times where it's good, times where it's bad. And Keynesians, and also new Keynesians, would be arguing that if we're in this region here, increasing the money supply isn't a bad idea. But if we're here, it'd be a terrible idea. All right, so that's one possible critique of the quantity theory of money. Another is what's known as a transmission mechanism of monetary policy. And this is the path that monetary expansion takes in order to affect real variables in the economy, right? The path that it takes can matter quite a bit. This equation doesn't really allow for different transmission mechanisms to be taking effect, right? What if monetary policy shocks drive down long-term bond yields? Well, in that case, what happens is that investors are going to be altering the holdings of their portfolios. To say they're holding a bunch of long-term government bonds. Those bond yields fall, and they're like, I don't think we really want to have this anymore. So what they do is they dump those long-term bonds, and they jump into private equity markets. And they end up driving economic activity via what's known as a portfolio rebalance effect, right? If you're holding a government bond that, is producing, say, 5% yield, expansionary monetary policy, long-term bond yields drop. Right now you're earning, say, 2% on that. You're like, screw it, I don't want this anymore. You dump it, you go to the stock market. You invest in the stock market, what's going to happen? Well, you're going to eventually get a little bit of growth in the economy, and this is what's known as a portfolio rebalancing effect, right? The channel through which monetary policy drives down long-term bond yields and increases stock prices is what's known as the very imaginative name, I know, portfolio rebalance channel, right? If monetary policy goes through, say, a bank lending channel, right? This one is actually much easier to think about because expansionary monetary policy, money base increases, banks can lend out more because they've got excess reserves. The way that would happen, right, is firms can essentially invest more in their growth. They borrow. You get households, borrowing large sums of money because they're like, I want to buy a house, I want to buy a new car, things like that. The path that the expansionary monetary policy goes through in that case is different than the portfolio rebalance channel, right? The variables that change and the order in which these variables change are very different from one another. So a change, say a one-time change to the money supply, can lead to larger changes in the money supply over time than it would if it went through a different channel. And it can lead to larger changes either in output or inflation if it goes through different channels. So the transmission mechanism really matters here. And the quantity theory of money doesn't allow for a transmission mechanism to really take place. It can't. Why can't it? Well, if you go back and look at the equation, MV equals PY. Okay, there's nothing in there about the money base. There's the money supply, which is related to the money base, right? But it's not the money base itself. There's nothing in there for stock markets. There's nothing in there for yields. right? It can't really account much for these portfolio or for these transmission mechanisms, right? Be it portfolio rebalance, bank lending. There are tons of other transmission mechanisms of monetary policy as well. And, well, the quantity theory can't do much for that. Another issue, inactive balances. What are those? Well, if you're hoarding money under the bed because you haven't trusted the bank since the crash in 29, well, okay, that money's not in circulation. It'll still be counted in the money supply, though, even though it's not in circulation, right? If you have a jar full of like $100 bills, well, those $100 bills aren't being spent. That money exists, right? That money is in the money supply, but it's not really circulating. So the velocity of money in this case is going to be a little different, right? Well, this can lead to the quantity theory breaking down because the money supply that's in circulation is not the same as the stock of money that exists. We can measure one, right? But the other one isn't really being measured all that well. The money velocity is going to change a little bit, yes, right? But the difference in the money that's actually circulating versus the stock of money is not going to be picked up, that it's not going to be like cushioned, if you will, by the velocity of money. So the main takeaway is if you want the theory to work, don't hide your money in the walls of your house. Now, this wraps up our talk about the quantity theory of money. We're going to talk about expected inflation next. I hope you enjoyed this lecture. I very much enjoyed making this lecture at like 11 o'clock at night. And, well, yeah, that's it. Peace.